Bettie's title of her session is I Hear You, but I'm Not Listening. Bettie Covington holds a master's in leadership and authored a self-published book by the same title, I Hear You, but I'm Not Listening. Bettie feels that a key element for any successful leader is to listen to the ideas, wants, and needs of others, and to blend those with the overall focus and goals of the project. What she discovered is people tend to hear without listening. This workshop will show attendees how to better understand the physiology involved in effective listening and to understand how our own upbringing, our experience, and bias affect the way we listen. Bettie is also a 2-time Distinguished Toastmaster, or DTM, in which she has demonstrated strong listening skills. Participants today will have the opportunity to experience a variety of listening techniques to help them improve their listening skills. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Bettie Covington, DTM.
Thank you so much, Miss Lisa. Today, I wanted it to be a very interactive workshop. So we have both Colleen and Lisa monitoring the chat. Feel free to ask questions at any time. I'm happy to take questions as we speak. And if you just now joined us, I'm asking everybody if you could be prepared with just 2 sheets of paper. I don't care what the paper looks like, just something that you can play with today, because we're going to do a couple of fun exercises. First of all, we're going to talk a little bit about the physiology of listening itself. Your body, your ears, can hear things. Hearing is a physical thing. You cannot stop it from happening. You're going to hear when something makes noise. You can't stop it. It just happens, unless you're hearing impaired, of course. But listening is a psychological event. Your brain actually has to focus on words and try to interpret those words into an ability to acknowledge or understand those words. So it actually takes effort on your part, unlike hearing, which is just involuntary. Something makes a noise and you're going to hear it. We're going to be talking about the psychological part then of hearing today and listening. So when is listening important? Is it important all the time? I'm going to challenge you to say, no, it is not. My husband, unfortunately, has gotten hooked on CNN. Just like my hero Snoopy, when I hear CNN, I hear wah, 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 wah. It's the same words over and over again. They don't come up with new information. They come up with, in my opinion, very biased information. It drives me nuts. I don't need to listen to CNN. I don't think it's good for me. And if you're a CNN fan, I apologize. It's just my personal opinion. So if you're in a grocery store and you're doing your shopping and you hear a mother with her little toddlers trying to diffuse why they can't have 17 different boxes of cereal, that's something you're going to hear because they're making noise. But it isn't something you have to listen to. But by the same token, if all of a sudden one of those children starts screaming, one of 2 things is happening. Either they tried to climb up to the shelf and fell down from getting the cereal box, or they're just throwing a temper tantrum. But you might want to turn your head and listen for a minute to see which of those things actually happened. So sometimes it's important to listen, sometimes it's not. Let me give you a hint. If you are a working person and your boss comes and hovers over your desk, that's one of those moments you should probably listen. Okay. Practicing for improvement is something that we can actually do. You get to choose whether or not you pay attention to voices. Let's say that you're having friends over, or you're going out to lunch with friends. You have an option to actually practice listening to what they say. Sometimes you're just going to hear them say, oh, work was terrible, or work was great. My kids are amazing, or my kids are awful. My husband did this, or my wife did that. Some of that stuff you may not want to listen to carefully, but you have an option to practice listening. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what that is, but it is a decision. Listening is an actual decision that you make. It's important also to know that distractions can be a barrier to listening. And most of us think distractions might be people moving around the room or making noise. Some people like music in the background. Some people are distracted by music in the background. You're thinking about things that you can hear. But you may not be aware that poor lighting is also a detriment to listening. So be aware of your surroundings and be aware that even the lighting in the room can be a distraction from being able to carefully listen to something. It can be a barrier or an inhibition to your listening ability. On this screen, I know there's a lot of words, but it's the communication cycle that we have all heard about many, many times. You speak to receive, you speak words, then somebody else receives those words. Then the receiver speaks words asking to confirm that they comprehended what you said. So I say that today is very, very hot. And the person I say that to says, when you say hot, do you mean it's over 110? And then I can provide feedback saying, yes, to me, 110 is the actual threshold from which I am no longer comfortable. Once it hits 110, it's hot. Below 110, it's tolerable. And then they say, I agree with you, or I disagree. I can go to 115 with my body temperature. It doesn't really matter. It's the give and take of the words going back and forth and the clarification. And then if it's something a little bit more in detail than the weather, it might be something, say, example, at work. Your boss gives you a project and you say, I'd be happy to take the project. What's the time frame? When's the delivery? And the boss tells you when the delivery is going to be and what 3 elements he wants you to deliver. And then you go back and you say, okay, I understand deliverable number 1 and number 2, but can you give me a little more details on deliverable number 3? Because I'm not exactly sure what that one entails. And then your boss tells you what deliverable number 3 is. And then you confirm, okay, so you want me to do A, B, and C, and you'd like to have the project completed no later than next Friday. That's the summary. That's kind of the whole communication thing that goes on. But sometimes communication, you have a problem where you don't get to give feedback. So here's the first piece of paper that I want you to work with. I'm going to give you instructions, and I'm not going to take any questions. I'm not going to provide feedback. I'm just going to give you instructions. And then when we're done, I'm going to test to see how well you did. Okay? So if everyone would take their first sheet of paper and just draw a circle about 3.5 inches in circumference. Once you have the circle drawn, I want you to draw an arc inside this circle. Now, once you've done the arc inside the circle, I'd like you to draw a mirror image of the arc at the top of the circle. Now, does everybody know what a herringbone pattern is? And it's kind of like this, or a chevron pattern where the lines go like this. I'd like you to draw chevrons on both of the arcs. Okay, it looks like everybody's done. So I had you draw a circle with a couple of things. Is that what you drew? I was describing the baseball. I don't know how well I described it, but that's what I was having you draw. How did you do? Does what you have sound anything like a baseball or look anything like a baseball? I wish I could see your faces and have you hold up your pictures. Thank you for being honest, Joe, and saying, no, it doesn't look anything like the baseball. That's where the feedback situation comes. Well, Betty, you told me to draw an arc. How big of an arc? How far into the circle should the arc go? And what do you mean by a chevron pattern? Well, that's the most I could come up with for stitch lines without calling them stitch lines. But you can see that what you drew does not match what I was trying to describe, simply because we couldn't close that communication gap. You weren't able to ask questions. I wasn't able to give further clarification. You should try this exercise with someone that you love and see how well they do. My husband and I didn't do so well either. Okay, the next thing that I want to talk about as an inhibitor or barrier to good listening is what I call emotional filters. Joe lives in Milwaukee. I was pretty much raised in Arizona since I was 10 years old. My husband's an Ohio boy. My kids live in San Diego and Reno. We have different influences, cultural influences. I've worked in corporate America most of my life. Karen and Lisa are both self-employed. And Colleen, I know you had a government job that caused you to travel all over the country. All of those influences that we get from the path that we walk influence what we filter in our information. When I was a young bride back in the olden days, I lived in San Diego for 3 years. And I had a neighbor next door that I got very close to who was a Navy wife. And she came from Pennsylvania. I was going to the store one day and I asked Anne if she needed anything. And she said, yeah, pick me up a green mango. Okay. So I went to the store and I found an unripe mango and I brought it back to her. And she said, no, I wanted a green mango. What she called in her neighborhood or her upbringing a bell pepper, they called green mangoes. The first time that Bert took me back to his family in Ohio, I went to my brother and sister-in-law's house, and they had a small farm. They had a personal garden that was roughly the size of my whole house. It was a huge garden. And they said, we're going to have fresh corn and zucchini for lunch. And I said, oh, that sounds amazing. So they sent me across to the garden to pick a couple of zucchini. Now, I don't know about most of you, but being a city girl, I go to the grocery store and I get a zucchini. It's about this big, right? So I'm walking up and down this enormous garden, looking everywhere through all these vines, trying to find zucchini. Cannot find it anywhere. And finally, my brother-in-law comes out and goes, "What's taking so long?" And I said, "I can't find the zucchini." And he said, "Well, Betty, there's one right by your foot." Well, he was pointing to something that was about this long and about this big around. It looked like the beginning of a watermelon to me, but certainly not a zucchini. You have filters that are different because of where you're from. Here's the best way I can think of to prove it. Think about the word mother and get a visual image in your mind. The word mother and get a visual image. Now add to the visual image the word dog and add mother and dog. Now you have two images in your mind, one of mother, one of dog. And I want you to add a third one, which is blue. Think about blue for a minute. Is this what you had in mind? There's my mom, just before she passed away, about a year before she passed away in Hawaii. That was my dog, Foster. He was just a sweet little silky terrier. And I couldn't even decide on which blue to pick. There are so many choices. So your filters that you have will change the way that you see things. Well, they'll also change the way that you hear things. Years ago, well, I'll just be real honest with you. Bert and I are going to be celebrating our 40th anniversary next month. When we were just in the throes of dating, I was coming off of a divorce from a police officer. And he pulled out his soapbox one day and stood up on it and started talking about things about the personalities of police officers. Now, I happen to have a fairly broad vocabulary, and I also understand the definition of the words that I use. So I told him that the only reason he felt that way was because he was ignorant. Filters? Did I mention filters? The definition of ignorant means uninformed, meaning you don't have a good understanding of something. However, I found out that day that it could also be a very inflammatory word because he took ignorant to mean unintelligent. My husband's a very intelligent man, but he was very offended when I used the word ignorant, meaning uninformed. So you have to be very careful in your communication to avoid what could be inflammatory vocabulary for certain, but also to make sure that when you use the word ignorant, that the receiver is hearing uninformed, not unintelligent. Does that make sense? So we talked about barriers to listening so far. We talked about extraneous noises or distractions that could be in your viewpoint. If I used to work in a high-rise building and I had a big window in my office, I used to keep the blind shut because it was so distracting to me to see everything that was happening outside my window that I couldn't hear what people were saying because I was too busy looking at the scenery. We talked about lighting being an impediment to good communication. It's a distractor. We talked about emotional barriers. because you hear things based on your life experiences. And of course, we talked about closing the entire communication gap based on having a strong discussion with people. Now, we're going to do another exercise with your sheet of paper. And this time, you don't need to write anything. We're going to tear a sheet of paper in pieces. You may have done this one in the past, but I want you to go ahead and do it along with me. And again, this is one of those things about not being able to ask questions, but also using your filters to do things. So I want you to take your sheet of paper and fold it in half. Once you have folded in half, I want you to tear off the lower right-hand corner. And I'm doing this along with you to make sure that we all get it correct. And then I'd like you to fold your paper in half again. And I'd like you to tear off the lower left-hand corner. And then fold your paper in half one more time. Tear off the lower right corner and tear off the lower left corner. It's getting pretty thick. It's kind of hard to tear. Okay. So now you used your filters. If any of you are left-handed, you probably folded your paper a different way than those of you who are right-handed. Some of you might have started folding your paper in half. When I told you to fold it in half, some of you folded it like this. Some of you folded it like that. Depending upon which way you folded it to begin with, both are half. But depending upon what you did, it changes the outcome of the exercise. So you should all have your papers completely folded, and it should look just like this when you're done. It doesn't look just like this? Well, we were all listening to the same instructions. I bet some of you put it in the chat if you have just a single hole in the middle of your paper. Because depending upon how you folded it, you may only have one big hole in the middle. Does anybody just have a single hole in the middle? Put in the chat if you've got a one hole or three holes or something else. 2 holes, okay. No holes, oh my goodness. I guess you just have scalloped edges then, Barb. You have a little person with no holes, okay. So you can see, again, using the filters that we have, the way that we hear instructions and interpret those instructions are not all the same. Those are our personal filters getting in the way. Another barrier to good communication or good listening is making judgments about people based on what you see. We all know that it's not a good thing as a human to be prejudiced. Our country has been rife with a history of prejudicial behavior. And I don't just mean blacks and whites. There's all kinds of different prejudicial behaviors. As I got more mature and my hair started going from blonde to white, I actually experienced ageism for the first time. And it was awful. I was so upset by it. And having the feeling of being prejudiced. Quite a number of years ago, Bert and I vacationed in Ontario, and we decided to drive over to Quebec. And when we got there, because we were not French speaking, we got some pushback from some of the locals. They didn't want to treat us the same way as if we were able to speak French with them. So there's all different types of prejudicial behaviors. But how does what you see impact your ability to listen? Okay, so this gentleman comes in and tells you that he is in love with your daughter and would like to have her hand in marriage. How do you feel about that? Are you even able to listen to what kind of a human being he is because of the way he looks? Are your prejudices stopping you from being able to hear that he's studying for the ministry, or that he is a psychologist and he helped troubled teens, and he looks like this because he was once a troubled teen? And so he went to school and got a degree in psychology to help other young men. Are you even able to hear that because of what you see? This young lady is applying for a job as customer service representative, a receptionist at your front desk in your office. And while you were talking, she would frequently play with the piercings in her tongue. Did she tell you that she's a college graduate with a dual degree in both political science and in business? Are you able to hear that? Are you able to bypass the clicking of the piercing on her teeth and look at her resume and listen to the way she answers your questions? This gentleman retired about 10 years ago from being a CEO in his company. And his wife died, and he doesn't have much meaning to his life anymore. But he would be very interested in coming to work in a lower capacity job just to be busy. Okay, Joe's got a good comment here. As a Filipino American that lived in Beijing, China for 3 years, he saw and experienced some degrees of racism, xenophobia, and anti-Americanism in mainland China. I can imagine that would be the case. Decades ago, it might have been in the 50s or 60s, there was a book written called The Ugly American about how Americans were so pompous when they traveled abroad. And a lot of foreign countries don't really appreciate the boldness and the arrogance of Americans who travel abroad. I'm not saying that you were arrogant or bold, Joe. I'm simply saying that is a reputation that Americans have. And so let's say that you're going to do a study abroad program. Maybe you have a fellowship or a mission service or something like that you want to do in a foreign country. People are going to make judgments looking at you as well as, unfortunately, you may look at them. And sometimes prejudging someone, what do they tell you? You have 30 seconds to make a good impression. People may not be able to hear what you say because of how you look. And conversely, you may not be able to hear what someone else says because of the way they look. So we need to be aware and try to put blinders on so that we don't let our visual cues impact our listening skills. Thank you for that great comment. I appreciate it. Okay, here's another barrier to good listening or good communication skills. You listen to respond. You don't listen to understand. Let me tell you a little story. When I was a little girl, I lived next door to Jimmy Oldham. And one day, Jimmy stole my bike. And he was riding my bike up and down the street in front of my house. And it was my bike. And I started chasing him on a gravel road. And I fell. And I cut my knee all the way to the bone. And I had to go to the hospital and get stitches. And I still have a big, ugly scar on top of my knee from when I fell down chasing Jimmy Oldham with my bicycle. Okay, be honest with yourself for a minute. How many of you were thinking about a bicycle story, a childhood playmate story, or a time that you had to get stitches in the hospital? It's a very natural thing to have happen. But when that happens, are we thinking more about our story, or are we listening to understand why the story is being told? It's not about you. I know that I just broke a bunch of hearts, and I'm sorry I broke your heart. But it's true. Listening is not about you. It's about the speaker. It's about the person who's trying to tell you something that's important to them. And so rather than for you to tell me your bicycle story or your story of your scar or the stitches that you got in the hospital or the car accident you were in or anything else, what ended up happening to your bicycle? Did Jimmy give it back? Did he feel bad because you fell down and cut your knee? Tell me more about what happened, Betty, when you fell and got gravel in your knee and had to go to the hospital. That's what we need to do to close the communication gap. We don't want to listen to respond. We want to listen to understand. Inspiring openness is one of the ones I think I find personally challenging. Okay, I'm going to allow you to judge me now. Are you ready? I'm a Republican. I'm registered to vote as a Republican. The truth of the matter is, I mostly vote as an independent. I voted for President Biden in the last election. I frequently will vote for Democratic candidates that are a little bit closer to the center line. I'm not a Republican over here. I'm a Republican, a very moderate Republican. I'm closer to the center line myself. But I am more Republican than Democratic in my thinking. My husband, on the other hand, is a Democrat. Way Democrat. He's a serious Democrat. And so we do talk politics in our house. And we sometimes have heated discussions about politics. So it's very important in a listening environment that you try to temper the words that you want to use, to temper the emotions or the passion that you might have on a subject. And there's all kinds of different ones other than politics. There's religion. There's whether or not you should eat meat or be a vegetarian, whether you should breastfeed or not, whether you should have your children in public school or private school or homeschool. There's lots of different topics where there's lots of different right answers. And it's important to avoid the listening barrier of getting into a debate unless it's important for you to do so. If you're having a debate, then you go ahead and argue your points. But most of the time, you're not in a debate. Most of the time, someone is trying to tell you why they feel the way they feel. And so what you need to do is to keep your arguments mentally. You don't want to say them out loud. Ask clarifying questions. This is a time where it's really important to not only nod your head and lean forward and show that you're listening, but also to ask those clarifying questions. Why do you feel that giving stimulus checks to gainfully employed individuals is a good idea? Why do you feel that the music program in schools is a critical part of a child's learning and should continue to always be funded? Why do you feel that it's important to get your COVID shot or not to get your COVID shot? These can all be heated subjects, but it's really important that you really listen to hear the other person's viewpoint. Let them tell you all of their key elements. Ask permission to take notes. You know, this is something that I can tell you're very passionate about. I'd like to just write down a couple of the things that you say so that I don't forget what you're saying. Does that make them pay attention and choose their words more carefully? Oh my gosh, she's writing down what I'm saying. I better make sure that I'm being clear on what point I am trying to make. So as you are doing that, that gives the originator of the idea an opportunity to say, okay, I've told you how I feel about getting the COVID shot. Now tell me why you feel differently. Tell me what is inhibiting you from getting the shot or encouraging you to get the shot. And then above all things, try to keep the temperature in the room as low as possible. Getting heated in debate is never going to solve a listening or communication situation. If you're yelling at each other, you're doing this. If you're interacting with each other, you're doing this. And that's when conversation is going to be able to take place. So for thorough understanding, particularly in challenging situations, you can challenge them mentally, you can ask questions, you can disagree in here. But only after you have thoroughly examined one person's view and gotten all of their points, should you then open the discussion to give your views as well. And I'm telling you right now, sitting back and not trying to give my opinions, I told you, this is one of my challenging parts for me. So what I'd like you to do now is you can write on the piece of paper that you wrote, that you drew your baseball on, what are some common traits of people that you aspire to be a good listener? Who do you know that's a good listener, and what are some of their common skills that you've noticed? I'll give you one example. Earlier, I said, when you're listening, lean forward. If you lean forward, that shows people that you're engaged. What else? A good listener takes 2 to 3 seconds before immediately responding. Great answer, Barb. Yeah, they stop to make sure that you're done talking. Never interrupt. A good listener makes sure that they understand. And the way that you do that is closing that communication gap, AJ, making sure that you're having that interaction, clarifying questions, and showing that you're thoroughly engaged by maintaining eye contact, by nodding your head, by leaning forward. All of those are really good examples of what a good listener does. Sometimes people, we call them in Toastmasters, have pregnant pauses when they're trying to get their thoughts in order, and they may pause, but they're not done speaking yet. So Barb, I really liked your answer there about pausing, because they could just be having that pregnant pause and they may not be done speaking. As you closing your communication style or segment, it's very important to come to an agreement with the other person. Now, this isn't going to be something you do in casual conversation. When your best friend calls and tells you about her shopping trip, that's, first of all, one of the things that you don't have to listen closely to. And second of all, it's not going to be one that really requires the complete communication circle. This is more of your child is talking to you about college selection. And they're trying to make a case for why they should be allowed to go to an out-of-state college. It's important for you to understand and to listen to that whole thing. And then you're going to restate some of the key points that the child made, and also restate your points about missing them, about economic opportunities, things of that nature. And then at the very end of the conversation, when it's something that really matters, you want to make sure that there is an agreement. And ladies and gentlemen, I will tell you that sometimes you'll be having a conversation, and I find this particularly in business, where you think that you have an agreement because you asked somebody to do something and they said, okay. That isn't necessarily an agreement. I used to work in a call center, and in the call center, we made a decision as a group that we were going to try to ask our members, our callers, we were going to try to ask a minimum of 3 open-ended questions prior to trying to solve any issues. By asking 3 open-ended questions, it would help us to get full clarification of the situation, a better understanding of what it was that they actually needed, and a more thorough understanding of why they were calling. So we made a discussion, a choice within our team that we were going to ask 3 open-ended questions. And everybody said, okay, how many people on the team do you think actually did it? Okay, there's a comment in here I just want to read real quick. Toastmasters who say they don't like pathways but cannot describe what they don't like when asking more probing questions about what they don't like. Exactly. So sometimes you have to ask questions, but you also want to avoid making the person feel like they're being interrogated. Why are you asking me all these questions? You don't want to make it uncomfortable for the person, but you do want to make sure that you, in your communication experience, you ask enough questions to understand. The example I was giving you from my work, though, as a team, we agreed to ask 3 open-ended questions, and that lasted about maybe a week. And then people went back to their old style of doing business because it wasn't something habitually comfortable for them. So If you're in a serious business negotiation and you reach an agreement, you have to make sure that all the parties really have a buy-in in generating an agreement to this conversation. We're going to close today with 9 techniques about listening. Starting out with liking to listen. We started out by saying listening is a decision. It's a physiological thing that you have to make a decision to do. So you might as well learn to like it, because if you're going to have to do it to be a good listener, then just convince yourself that you're doing a better job of making people feel comfortable with you. People who know me well frequently refer to me as a relationship builder. It comes from liking to listen. I ask people questions and then I just listen. And I don't listen to respond, I listen to understand. Second key is to ignore distractions. When you're in an important conversation, try to just phase out everything that is around you. Try to get into an environment, if it's really important, close the office door or turn off the TV or the music or whatever. Try to ignore the distractions. As you're having your communication circle, summarize as you go. If it's a big thing, okay, so far I understand this, this, and this. Is that right? Okay. And then try to tame those emotions. Having flare-ups or having deep emotional reaction is going to be harder for the speaker as well as the listener. So if you can try to keep the emotions inside here and not respond or react, it's helpful. We showed pictures of those 3 people that might be objectionable upon first view. Be aware of making hasty judgments about people and letting that interfere with your ability to learn more about them and to listen. And of course, don't interrupt. Barb, I think your suggestion of waiting that extra 2, 3, 5 seconds after they're done is an inspired decision. Inspiring openness. If you're open, your sender will probably be open as well. So try to be as open as you can. Show that you're listening, show that you're engaged, and try to make sure that the people that you're interacting with feel that you are genuinely, and genuine is a very key word here, make sure that you're genuinely interested. Know when you really need to listen. Sometimes there's just the talking voices, wah, 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 about my shopping trip. I had to go to the grocery store. I picked out a cute new dress. Sometimes it's an important thing. This is what my doctor told me is going to happen. So make sure that you know and can differentiate when you need intense listening skills and when you can just casually listen. And then at the end of your conversations, generate conclusions, come to a mutual decision. And as you do that, you'll have filled all of your listening skills. Each of these techniques, if you take the first letter of each of these techniques, they actually spell the word listening. Colleen, you sent this up, and it's a lunch and learn, and I'm hoping that everybody got to eat and chew and digest while they were listening today.
I hope so too, Betty. And really, that was such a relatable subject for all of us. Really wanted to know, what would you say if you have somebody who keeps talking over you? There's no way to get a word in edgewise.
I let them talk, and I become very, very obvious. And eventually they'll have to stop and take a breath, and they'll realize, oh, did I interrupt? Good question.
Thank you.
I don't see any other questions. So Lisa and Colleen, thank you so much for allowing me to share this information with everyone today. Why don't we give everybody back their 5 minutes to go and get a drink or beverage of their choice before they have to get on to their next thing.
Well, before we do, I think thank you very much. And for everyone in the chat, please give a round of applause or claps, or in this case, just put clap, clap, clap or something in the chat, please. Thank you, Betty. You are our first webinar speaker for this series, and you brought up a great topic. So thank you for your time today as well. And before we sign off, oh, that's great. Thanks. Before we sign off, also, please remember that we're going to do this the 2nd and the 4th Friday of every month at 11:30 to 12:30. Make it an hour so you can bring your lunch like Betty described and just sit and listen and see what we can pick up, what we can do to learn, not just to move ourselves forward, but then hopefully to move our clubs forward as well in this year as we continue our Rise Up theme. So check back on the 23rd. We'll have that posted hopefully on our D3 events calendar very soon. So that way we can get to the next topic. And again, thank you, Betty. This was fantastic. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Everybody have a great afternoon and a safe weekend.
Thanks for attending, everybody.
Bye-bye.